All right. Um, so our second AWS crash course for the Certified Cloud Practitioner cert is focusing on security, identity, compliance. Security is obviously a huge deal in the cloud. It's one of the biggest weighted areas on the exam. So again, security, identity, compliance is a big part of the exam. So in terms of where to focus your energy, I would start here. We'll see how to control access with identity management. We'll talk about multi-factor authentication. And then there is frankly just a smorgasbord of different names of different AWS services that are easy to confuse. And this is where the flashcards come in handy because I have used AWS for real work and Code Platoon uses it in our AI Cloud Ops course, but I've never used AWS Shield, WAF, Guard Duty, Macy, or Inspector. So there's no way around the flashcards and the memorization and the taking notes to get this stuff to stick into your brain. Because some of these things you can play around with and you'll see. And the Cloud Quest game is great for that. Some you won't. And then we'll talk about what's called governance tools. So we have identity management and securing the environment. And then we have governance, which is making sure that everyone's doing the right thing. You know, someone's walking around with the clipboard, checking boxes off, like, did we set up the firewall? Did we set up multi-factor authentication? And so on, and like logging things, right? And that's what these governance tools like CloudTrail config, and then AWS organizations are for. Again, this is high value for exam points, so definitely like take some notes as we go here. So we're going to learn about what's called the shared responsibility model, which is a big part of AWS security and security principles. We're going to talk about IAM users, groups, roles, and policies. And we might do a little bit of hands-on here. We're going to talk about multi-factor authentication, more identity stuff with the IAM Identity Center, um, some AWS tools for threat detection, and then again, this list of all these different AWS services, of which there are many. After today, you should do another practice exam. Again, if you haven't done your first, just dive in and do it. The goal is to fail fast. That's really the goal. And I just encourage you guys to just get over the hump and do it. Tony and Rick can attest, like they survived. They're still with us. They're still here. Um, it, if any of you guys have ever studied for this, like sort of a multiple choice conceptual exam like this kind of fail fast method is pretty standard. And again, my goal is to get a bunch of wrong questions because then I can review them and really dig in, and that's how I start to memorize this stuff. Again, we have a reflection prompt. In the lessons, there are also some sort of hands-on exercises that you can actually do on AWS if you want. We might do one. In the interest of time, we're not going to do too many. We also have a bunch of links to official AWS documentation. I do recommend looking at some of this. For instance, the shared responsibility model. This is like a big concept, right? And the big concepts show up a lot, and getting used to the jargon is important. So this is worth taking maybe 5 to 10 minutes to read. And again, I would add this link as a source to my Google Notebook LM, and I might ask it to summarize it for me if I don't want to read it. I might stick it in my AI and ask for a summary. And so that I think is part of the value of these things. Um, and we'll get into this. We'll get into it when we get there in the curriculum. And then we have again links to other official docs as well. And then another practice exam. So let's dive on in. Let's talk about the shared responsibility model. This is sort of the big boy. Um, so shared responsibility model. And is this font size good for everyone? We can all see okay. We'll make it even bigger just for fun. Security and compliance are a shared effort between AWS and the customer. And if I've created an AWS account and I've logged into the console and I'm making EC2s, I am the customer, right? The customer in this case is really a technical customer. It's us, the developer, it's the business. AWS is responsible for some things. We are responsible for others. And this sounds simple, and it mostly is. However, the exam being a concept-based multiple choice exam, you're going to see a lot of this jargon, right? So again, think about infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service versus software as a service, right? With software as a service, they're probably responsible for all the security, but AWS really gives us a platform as a service and sort of an infrastructure as a service. So AWS is responsible for securing a physical data center. Pretty straightforward, right? The customer, I'm responsible for making sure my data is secure inside AWS. Um, if we think about data in Postgres, if we put if we used Amazon's relational database or RDS, which is how we can have Postgres or any other kind of relational database like MySQL or whatever on the cloud. If we think about putting Postgres and our personal project apps or just our web apps as we've learned about them in general on AWS, what's an example of like our responsibility for securing this data in the database? And I do have one specific thing in mind that's sort of the classic example, but there's a couple right answers here. So this is a borderline trick question. Tom, yes, sir.
Authentication.
What about authentication? What goes in the database related to authentication?
Like token management or keys, etc.
Yep, tokens, keys, and
Roles.
rules. Yep.
Well, I
And
said roles, but
oh,
yeah.
roles. Yep. And I would simplify that even further, guys. Those things are true, and even simpler, passwords, right? Like I might do all this great infrastructure security stuff, but when we saw in Django, we still need to write that line of code the right way so that a password is encrypted before we put it in the database. And AWS isn't going to stop us from doing that. So if I do something silly on AWS, like store passwords in plain text in my database, that's on me. And do folks have questions around that? Does that part kind of make sense? Cool. So again, going up on this, we learned about regions and availability zones, and there's this whole global infrastructure, and AWS is responsible for the security for that. But I'm still responsible for security groups, making sure that on my EC2, every single port isn't exposed to the public internet, configuring identity and access policies to make sure that like one user doesn't have root access to just delete the database entirely. AWS is responsible for networking security and hypervisor security. I'm responsible for updating and patching EC2 instances if I'm spinning up an EC2, right? So if I'm spinning up an EC2, I need to make sure I might need to patch that operating system. If I'm using NPM, I need to update that. AWS is responsible for security for hardware and like the physical location, which sort of overlaps with this, but I've got to manage the firewall rules. So why does this matter? How many people heard about like the Target data breach a bunch of years ago? I see one or two hands. Let's just Google that one up. So, unfortunately, big companies have massive data breaches all the time, and probably all of our personal information is out there on the internet. And Target, our beloved big box store, had a massive data breach in 2013. And somehow hackers infiltrated and they got payment and contact information. Target lost a lot of money. The personal and financial information of over 40 million customers was exposed. So, why does this matter? It matters, first of all, so that we know what we're responsible for, so we can make our side of the fence secure. And also, frankly, you know, I'm sure when the Target data breach happened, if Target was using AWS, the lawyers were thinking about suing. And if so, AWS was probably like, no, because like this was what we're responsible for. This is what you're responsible for. So there's a liability aspect as well as a security and best practices aspect, right? And a lot of the test questions are going to ask about who does what, right? How often is AWS going to have something go wrong on the exam? Rarely. How often is the question going to be about the customer configuring something correctly? Much more often. So our shared responsibility model, the cloud provider is responsible for the security of the cloud, hardware, um, some software, global infrastructure, anything in the cloud, and our data and applications and configuration, we, the customer, are responsible for. Um, in the interest of time, I'm not going to do this hands-on lab. Um, but I do. Well, this is a good one to do actually, and I do have the AWS console open here. Um, so this is probably the only hands-on lab we'll do for today, but I do recommend that you guys do these hands-on labs on your own. So in AWS, one of the key ways that access control is managed is with security groups. And in the AWS console, you'll find that you usually just want to search for the thing you're looking for because the menu navigation is painful. So I could create a security group and we'll call it, as the hands-on lab says, my open security group. And the inbound rules, remember, determine what traffic is allowed in. So I could have a database or an EC2 or an S3 file server or any kind of AWS resource and use this security group for a whole bunch of things. So let's add an inbound rule allowing all traffic. Let's see if I can get this rule right. All traffic, all ports, source type. Anywhere. Note that AWS is giving me a warning here that I'm basically letting anyone from the internet just access like any port here. So we're gonna add the rule, and now let's make an EC2, and we'll just make a virtual server, and we'll call it my open EC2 just to keep it simple. And we'll give it a description, instance type. I'm not even going to worry about like a key pair, and let's add it to our the security might not have found the security group yet. So we can go ahead and normally you would make an SSH key, but in this case, we're just adding it to a security group. And now let's see if I can add it to a security group. And I'm not sure what's going on here. I apologize. Maybe I created the security group wrong, or maybe I can't find it for some reason. Um, so I'm just going to go back and I'm just going to destroy this EC2. And this is part of the joys of, there we go. Part of the joys of the AWS console is just the pain of navigating through it. And I'll go back and destroy that security group later because I don't even like it existing. So I'm probably not going to do the other hands-on labs for today. I do think these are worth doing because I think just getting your hands dirty with the AWS console a bit helps make this stuff a bit more concrete. Um, and it does let you play around with this stuff. So here's some practice questions, and I know some of these are straightforward, but let's go ahead and tackle them anyway. Who is responsible for securing a security group in an AWS environment? Is it the data center operator?
Customer?
Yeah, it's the customer, right? The security group that I was just fiddling around with and kind of failed on. It's my job to set it up. And it's my job to add it to the EC2. It's basically a virtual firewall. The security group is basically a virtual firewall. So this is security in the cloud. So if I screw up, right, and there's a data breach, it's on me. So which of these is AWS responsible for? Is AWS responsible for encrypting my application data? What do we think? Yes or no?
No.
No. Cricket, I saw you shaking your head as well. I agree. That's our job. Is AWS responsible for patching an EC2 operating system?
No.
No. And Sam, I saw you shaking your head there as well. Um, and managing physical access to data centers?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and thank you guys. And this is where, even though this is an easy one, like it's not always easy to parse these questions, right? And just seeing these helps to get more familiar with them and reading them through. So a company fails to handle encryption for customer data stored in an S3. Who's responsible? So the customer, right? Here's a better question. What's an S3? Does everyone want to take a guess? Right. We probably haven't seen this one yet, which is why I wanted to touch on it. Rick, yes, sir.
It's a shot in the dark, but it kind of reminds me of the different kind of servers like on AWS you got AC3 and S3. I don't know if that's like a server for maintaining authentication or
Ballpark. It's a server.
simple storage service. All right.
Yeah. It's basically a file server. And in fact, let's create one of these right now. So, like a lot of the times, students for their personal projects, they might want to deal with image assets. Um, and the question of where do I store those images comes up. And you don't really put images in a database. And so one use case for a simple storage service like S3 is this is your image server. So if you think about like Imgur to where its job is just to share memes and images, um, you could use S3 for that, right? And it's called an S3 bucket, and we'll just call it Buffalo bucket. There's some customization options. When you put something in it, they call it an object, but you can treat it really like a file server. It does things like if you have different versions of something. For instance, if I do npm run build to do a build version of my React app, I can have different versions up there with like different commit hashes. And I've seen that as a way of hosting a front end on an S3 bucket. And so you can have bucket versioning and lots of other nifty features. And we could add it to a security group. And we can set up encryption and other security settings. And let's see if this lets me create the bucket. Buffalo bucket AWS crash course. And if I look in here, there's nothing in here. And in fact, I can actually upload things. And let's just add a file. And just for fun, let's add a practice test. And it has a URL. Um, it also has a URL to access it. So I could make an API call to interact with this. For instance, I'm not sure if I've exposed it to the internet, but I can have different things interact with this. So S3 stands for Simple Storage Service, and I can store files, images, videos, and stuff like that in there for, say, my Django app to interact with, or maybe I'm putting a React app there and users through their browsers are grabbing it from the S3 bucket. So I went maybe a little too deep down the rabbit hole here, but again, fail fast, do that first practice quiz, bomb it, and then as you go through these questions, when you hit something that you don't know, Google it up. Um, Last couple questions. What's a shared responsibility between AWS and the customer here? So let's use the process of elimination. Is physical security shared? Obviously not. Yeah, I see some shaking of heads. What about securing the hypervisor? Does that sound like it's going to be shared? Again, shaking of heads, right? These things like sound like AWS's job. They're part of the cloud. So now we've got two things left. IAM role assignment. Is that one going to be shared? I see some nods. What about network configuration at the OS level? So why not? So we're down to like two candidates here. Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, that could be iffy, but usually, except for like Linux, usually network configuration at the OS level I would think would be like a default standard. I mean, you can really get into Linux and like set up firewall rules and networking configuration, but for the average user, I would think that would be something that would be set up by default.
And what about IAM role assignments? We've talked a little bit, but not a lot about IAM. What is it, and who do we think owns it? Rick, yes, sir.
Yeah, that's the user. I can't remember what it stands for, but it basically
Yeah,
means like you have a super user role on whatever server you build.
yeah, yeah, totally. Um, and yeah, good job, guys. And the answer here is network configuration at the OS level. AWS does some stuff, infrastructure level networking, but as customers, like I still have to handle firewalls and ports and stuff like that if I spin up an EC2.
So I was
Um,
wrong. Ah, darn.
you were half wrong. Um, but we still got the right answer. And that's part of these kinds of exams too. Like every now and then, about 25% of the time, whenever I have to do an exam like this, I get questions where it's like, I don't know what that is, but I know what these are. And if I can use the process of elimination, I got myself to like 50% odds pretty quickly. Even if I don't know what IM is, I've now got a 50% odds of getting this right. You do that with enough questions and you get more of them right. And you know, that's just the nature of these kinds of exams. Like that's how they're supposed to be done. Um, AWS is responsible for patching the OS on your EC2. I remember mentioning this, so this one's going to be a gimme. AWS only secures the underlying infrastructure. So we've talked about division of responsibilities, the shared responsibility model, why it matters, and some of the most common security failures, and seen some sample questions. I do think what I'm going to do is I'm going to like call on people as we go through like the other lessons, just so it's a little more interactive. Why don't we take five and then we'll come back and we are going to look at IM. Sound good? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. All right, so now we're going to talk about identity and access management, or IAM. Users, roles, groups, multi-factor authentication. This is sort of the core tool for managing a lot of access control stuff. It controls who can do what in your cloud environment. On the exam, you're going to expect to know how IAM manages users, it manages groups, it manages roles, then there's policies and multi-factor authentication and how they relate to real world stuff. So, what is this thing? Identity and access management is the first thing you should tackle when you're doing real world work with AWS. You create identities with it. An identity is not necessarily a person. Sometimes an IAM user might be there for a program to use because you get an access token and you define what permissions they have. For individual people, you would create an IAM user. So basically, on the cloud, we need identities, right? And this is what I use to create an identity and create a user. I can group up users. And when I have groups, I can assign different policies to those groups. If I need to make an exception to the rule, I can use what's called a role. And this sort of gives temporary access to AWS resources, as it says here, often used by services or external partners. IAM lets you write policies that allow or deny specific AWS actions based on conditions. And let me go ahead and let's pull up. I should be logged into the console. Let's take a look at IAM. And this stuff is confusing. I'm not going to lie. There is IAM and there is IAM Identity Center. And as I've learned the hard way, never the twain shall meet. Um, if we look here in the Code Platoon YouTube, let's go to, I apologize. I think I'm in the wrong. Yeah, I apologize. I think I'm in the wrong AWS organization to show the users that we have on that we have in our AWS group. I think this for Cloud Ops it's somewhere else. But we can see here we've created some temporary roles. And like here's a hello role from Avenger. Um, Policies. So this is sort of like the guts of it. Um, we can create custom policies, but as you can see, these policies go from very broad to really granular, and these are created by AWS automatically. So for instance, here's an administrator access policy, and it has a massive list of permissions of all the different things that it can do. So once I create a user, I can add them to a group. And when I have that group, I can give that group a policy. And I kind of have to know the policy that I'm looking for. Um, let's attach a policy. There we go. And so I would pick this administrator access policy, for example, or I'm not going to pick that one. But as you can see, the policies get really granular and they're for even specific services. And let's just attach this AI Ops Assistant policy. And as the description says, it provides read-only permissions required by the Amazon AI Operations Assistant. So if I want a bunch of users to have read-only access to whatever AI Ops is, I would attach this policy to this group. So it's incredibly granular and not simple at all, but extremely powerful. And they have advisors and other things as well. Roles work the same way. Um, if I create a role, I have to kind of choose what this is for, and then you can get really specific. Um, like if I want an EC2 to be able to talk to other AWS services because I'm running some sort of code on it, then I would do that here. So this stuff is not straightforward at all. It's not hard. There's just a lot of moving parts. Luckily for the exam, we don't need to dig into all the dirty details. We're not going to need to know a massive list of all the possible policies. I just wanted to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here. So again, we have users, groups, roles, and then the guts of everything, which is policies. Users are for people, developers, admins, interns. I want to log into the AWS console, SSH onto an EC2, add a file to an S3 bucket. I need to create an IAM user to give it to that person. Um, to manage what that person can do, I'm probably going to assign them to a group. So I can assign dev access so developers can interact with the database, but not delete the actual database instance, for example. Or I might have an administrator group. And then roles are actually how we let code or other AWS services access things or grant temporary access. Like if I have Django running and I wanted to access my image server that's on an S3 bucket, I would need to create a role for it to do that. And policies are the rules that we can give to roles or groups. So again, user, group, role. Users, and they all get policies. And let's do a little writing here. So all the way down here, we have policies. Policies can be assigned to a group. Policies can be assigned to a role. And then users are assigned to a group. I think users can be assigned to a role, but I'm actually not certain. And then we have tons of different policies. So it's not uncommon where you might have several applied to a group or role. And I just want to pause here and see if folks have any questions. Um, the policies are actually written in JSON. You can write your own policy. As you can see, AWS has a ton. Um, I apologize. I guess we actually can attach policies to users. I got that wrong. Can I attach an AWS policy to an IAM user? And I was totally wrong here. Yeah, yes, I can. So it's more a question of using groups for management. So I apologize about that. Um, best practice, this term is important. Least privilege. Only give the permissions that's needed. Because you can see how complex this stuff is, and you can imagine how it can become a big spaghetti mess real fast. So if you always follow the principle of least privilege, you keep things as simple as possible. You sort of reduce the surface area for attacks and errors. And because if my EC2 needs to talk to an S3 bucket to get images from it, I only want to give it permission to do that. And then if some malicious group or person gets access to my EC2, if my EC2 is locked down and it can only do that one thing, the damage is limited. And when you read about these breaches at Target or of all things, the credit card, or like the credit score companies like Experian and stuff had a big data breach a bunch of years ago. A lot of the times it's probably this least privilege kind of issue. Um, and do folks have any questions or stuff that you're curious about when it comes to users groups, roles, policies? Cool. Let's talk about multi-factor authentication. Real quick, I think we're all familiar with this. This is where I want to log into my bank and I haven't done it in a while. And it says, hey, we've sent you a code on your phone. Type in the code in order to log in, right? Where I have two ways I need to authenticate. Because here's, my laptop, and here's me with my phone. And then, here's my bank. And the bank wants to make sure that the person talking to it from the laptop really is me. So if the bank knows that the person typing in the password on the computer is the same person that just received the code on their phone, they've gotten multi-factor authentication. And this has just become best practice for pretty much everything, right? And it can be required and it should be required for IAM users. And so it's a really common question on this exam about like multi-factor authentication. The answer is almost always going to be you should enable it if it's people, right? If we're talking about a role for the EC2 bucket, I can't enable multi-factor authentication for it. But if we're talking about people, we almost always want MFA. So the IAM Identity Center is a newer, fancier way of managing AWS. Um, you can use it to do more sophisticated things, such as logging in to multiple AWS accounts, to managing more identities, something called federated access. Um, if for some reason, maybe we have some services that aren't on AWS, maybe we're using a different authentication provider. Okta is a third-party authentication provider. And let's go to their, here we go, single sign-on. So if I want to add single sign-on with like Gmail to my web app, um, probably want to use Okta, or another big provider is called Auth. Um, so there might be a situation where we've built a web app and it's using Auth, or we're using Google, and we need some other authentication services to interact with IAM, and that's where Identity Center comes in as well. So let's knock out these questions. Ryan, you want to allow an EC2 instance to access an S3 bucket. Which IAM identity type should you use? You might be muted.
I'm gonna say B.
All
Oh,
right. So the answer is not B. This is a good one. This is awesome. Honestly, when studying, the getting stuff wrong is better than getting stuff right. Because that's right. Getting stuff right. Once I do it the first time, it's in my head. Once I do it the second time, I know it better. Once I do it the third time, it's kind of sealed down. But after that, it's, the value decreases. But when I get something wrong, this is when I'm actually going to learn and improve. So a role is usually what we use for software to interact with services. And I got this wrong earlier as well. So I apologize. So if I have an EC2 or a resource or software that I want to control access or give it access to things, we're probably going to use a role. Good job, man, and thank you. Next on the list is Tom. Which of the following allows a developer to log into the AWS Management Console?
I feel like this is a trick question slightly, because either I'd say C because a developer is a user, or D because it's a policy that actually allows them the access to log in. So I'm going to say D. Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. I'm not gonna lie, I actually was with you on this one. I expected the answer to be D. Um, I think you know what the issue here is. I'm thinking of SSHing into an EC2. But if you think about logging into the AWS Management Console, yeah, I'm a little surprised as well about that one. That one
Yeah,
might be worth Googling, but
yeah,
I
the wording just threw me off because it just says which of the following allows a developer to log in, not like where does a developer belong in
yeah,
this.
yeah. Oh, and look, there's this app called Quizlet. Um, yeah, it's if we dig into it, we would probably find like the exact details. But I think the short version, and for now, I'm going to stick with that just in the interest of time, is that I guess the answer is we could have a policy, but if you don't have a user, they can't log in. And maybe that's what they're thinking about here. A good example of why a lot of this is just about doing a whole bunch of practice questions. Tom, thank you, sir. Sam, you're next up. You want to apply the same permission set to all junior developers. What's going to be the best IAM strategy?
Uh,
Do we
C.
create a group, attach policies to the group, add users to the group? Yes, sir. Right, right. If I've got a bunch of people that I want to have the same rules, I'm probably going to want to use a group. I could do it this way, but that's not the best way. Good job, man. Thank you. And finally, oh, no, we have a couple more. Question for Alex. What AWS security feature requires a code from a mobile device in addition to a password?
We'll go B. We're locking in B.
Yes, sir. Multi-factor authentication. And a lot of the questions on the exam are going to be more straightforward ones like this. Um, I don't know what KMS is. Let's actually look that up. That's what I like to do when I'm doing these questions. And if I'm quizzing myself or it's not a timed exam, I'll just Google it right when it's fresh in my mind after each question. Um, so KMS stands for AWS Key Management System to manage cryptographic keys. Um, all right, that's awesome. We've now learned another useful piece of information for the exam. Um, Last question here, and Rick, I believe you are up for this one. And Alex, thank you, man. A user is assigned, and I guess this is a trick question. A user is assigned a policy that allows S3 star, but is also part of a group that explicitly denies S3 delete object. What happens? And what's
I
going
would
on here?
say, yeah, I would say, all right, so user is assigned a policy that allows S3, but also a group that explicitly denies. So I would say that um, they have access to S3, but they can't delete objects on S3. So I'd say B, the user cannot delete objects.
And why do you think, what's your logic behind B?
Because well, I'm thinking of stacking policies. So you have one policy that says you can do everything to S3, but then you have a group policy under that that says you can do everything but delete objects. So I would say that the delete objects, you can do everything except for deleting objects.
Yeah,
I,
I
I
agree with you.
that's what I'm thinking.
That logic of stacking policies makes sense to me. And kind of like with CSS, where the more explicit rule takes precedence, I'm kind of imagining this more explicit rule taking precedence. I don't actually know. Let's see here. Yep, deny
Ooh,
takes precedence, and the reasoning is different, but good to see. An explicit
deny.
deny is always going to override allow.
Okay, so D
Yeah.
then. Deny. Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah. All right. I guess so.
Oh,
Yeah,
I thought you
it's
said,
kind of. Yeah, I said B, the user cannot delete objects because I was thinking, they can do everything but delete
oh,
an object because of their
we Yeah, you were correct. We have this wrong in
oh.
here. The yeah,
Oh,
the
okay.
yeah.
So I
So I'm
am right.
looking
All
at
right.
this. Yeah. The I think when we wrote this, we just didn't put the exact answer wording in here, and it's confusing because we have the same language here. But I'm looking at this, and if I look at
Okay.
this explanation, explicit deny always overrides allow. That tells me, yeah, so you were correct.
Okay.
Um,
All right. For a second, I thought it was saying I was wrong. All right.
oh, good deal.
Cool beans.
We have an optional exercise here. I'm not going to go through it. I do recommend you guys do it. Again, I think the goal of this um is just getting just having like something so it's not just a bunch of words. So you've interacted a little bit with IM and policies and users because that really helps make it stick. That Cloud Quest game, the cheesy 3D game we saw the other day, will also have you do a bunch of this stuff as well. Like you'll create security groups and users and IM policies and things like that as you go through that. So I'm a big fan of that Cloud Quest game, as you can tell. Um, so we've learned about the identity types for IM. We've got users, we've got groups, we've got roles, right? Those are our identity types. Users, groups, and roles are the identity types. We've got IAM policies, we've got multi-factor authentication, and some real-world services. Next up is the smorgasbord of AWS security services. Let's take five, and then we'll dive into that one. Thank you guys, and see you all in 5 minutes. So, security, as we've talked about with these data breaches, is a really big deal. So while there's identity management and doing that, there's a whole bunch of other aspects to securing an infrastructure or a platform. And AWS provides a whole bunch of tools to help accomplish this. So we're gonna learn about these. These are probably the things that are going to require the most memorization because the IM stuff you can fill around with in the console and learn about. The Cloud Quest game will do it. These you really can't. You can look them up, but it's kind of a pain. Um, so there's a bunch of different tools. One is called AWS Shield. Its job is to protect from denial of service attacks. So a key use case of this is protecting a public-facing website or a public-facing REST API. A denial of service attack is when I, as a malicious hacker, have, say, paid for money to rent time on a botnet that has thousands of compromised computers of individuals in coffee shops or at their homes and send so much internet traffic, like so many GET requests at the same time to an API that the server can't handle that number of requests and is overloaded, right? It's a distributed denial of service attack. So that's one of the classic web attacks, and the job of AWS Shield is to protect from that. And let's see if we can at least look it up in the console, just so we can see what it looks like. And we have WAF and Shield together. And as you can see, even in the console, it's not just like set up and configure it. It's like talking about it and all these things. And they I think they cost more money. You know what I mean? I have to subscribe to it, it looks like. Um, but at least we can kind of see something visual to put with the name. So AWS WAF is for blocking malicious web traffic to help stop attacks like SQL injection or cross-site scripting. Guard duty is for threat detection and anomaly incidents. So this one's a little different. It's actually going to monitor to see if an EC2 is trying to like access user passwords in a database or do something that it normally doesn't do. And on really big infrastructures, um, anomalous activity is a big part of security. Google's famous for having everything really locked down. And like even as a developer at Google, like I can't just go and access whatever service I want. And it's like when you try to log into your bank from another country or use an ATM from somewhere, very far away from where you normally are. It's an anomalous activity. Your bank flags it automatically and asks you, "Hey, is this really you?" And guard duty is doing something along those lines as well, right? It's now using machine learning and other things and threat detection. So, as it says here, detect when your EC2 instances are used to mine cryptocurrency or communicate with IP addresses and domains associated with known malicious actors. Like all the IP addresses belonging to Russia, I think, are considered malicious actors these days. There's like huge ranges of known malicious actors, or China. China would really be the big relevant one, um, in terms of like security. So Macy, sensitive data discovery, like personal identifying information. If I screw up and put a whole bunch of people's credit card information and social security numbers in an S3 bucket as files, the job of Macy is to help find that. And again, this is using, these days, it uses machine learning and other things. So it's going to actually look over our different services. It looks like this one focuses on S3, and it looks to see if there's personally identifying information that's there. right? Using machine learning and some of the regex stuff that we learned about with AI chatbots. And finally, there's something called Inspector that will look at all of our EC2s and some other resources to see for common vulnerabilities or common misconfigurations and flag them for us. Because let's just pretend Netflix is using AWS. They have hundreds, they might even have thousands of EC2 virtual servers and stuff. There is a lot of infrastructure to manage. So you need these automated tools to help you really keep track of it, right? So it continuously scans things and it looks for software vulnerabilities, unintended ports being exposed, and things like that, right? So AWS Inspector is pretty important. And as it says here, these often show up in the scenario-based questions, like what would I use to detect that the port was exposed on an EC2 that wasn't? Well, the answer might be AWS Inspector. And I just want to check in and see if folks have questions or stuff that we're curious about. So it's kind of cool to think about this bigger infrastructure, right? I think that's one of the pluses of studying for this exam and learning about this stuff for the first time. Because this is again, everything just gets bigger, right? Our projects have gotten bigger, going to Django is bigger, and now we're going from not just like one software application, but a whole system or a whole infrastructure of which our application is only a part. And even though we might not be responsible for building all of this, the knowledge of it really helps us and is a core part of modern software engineering. Rick, yes, sir.
I was just gonna ask all this stuff is like really good. Not saying that it's not, but what try to figure out how to ask this question. What plan do some of these normally fall under for AWS? Because I know like
Yeah.
whenever it comes to like accounts and servers and stuff like that, some users may want to take control of how DDoS is prevented against, or maybe like they want to use a special firewall on their Linux server that either they're not paying for or they are paying for, and they'd rather not use like AWS. They've got other ways that they want to safeguard against all these different threat detections and things.
Yeah, totally. So, like these particular services, I think you have to pay for. I don't think they're they're free. I don't think they're opt-in. Some of this stuff AWS probably does do automatically, um, simply because, as it says, part of their job is to secure the cloud. Um, and a lot of this is targeted for enterprise customers, where I'm not managing one or even two or three EC2s, but I'm managing maybe like dozens to hundreds of containers with EC2s, and they're spun up and managed automatically. And, I'm dealing with maybe like hundreds of software engineers, right? If we're working for JP Morgan and we have the big cloud infrastructure that JP Morgan uses, something of that size, then you need to use these. If it's just me, honestly, if I was running a startup, I don't know if I would use these either if I just had like one or two EC2s.
And
Just to review.
other reason, sorry, go ahead.
No, what's up?
I was just going to say that question was also kind of aimed at everyone else in the class. like when you start looking for places to host your projects or your your final personal projects, that's things that you need to read the fine print to figure out what, whatever you're doing, AWS or you're going with Hostinger or whoever. But those are things that you need to understand about the fine print, like what they do for you. Do they prevent DDoS? Do they back up your server every 24 hours? Do they, what do they do? Because I'll tell you right now, there are hackers that are just out there watching for like new sites to pop up, and if you're not if you're not careful, somebody will take control of your site, and you won't even know it till it's too late. So I
Yeah,
say that from some experience too. So
the only thing I would add to that, I agree that stuff is important to learn, and I don't want to go too far down this discussion just to stay focused on the
yeah,
course
that's fine.
exam stuff. Yeah, but you touch on a good point. And actually with AWS, like what are AWS built-in firewall security on the free tier? Because you raise a good point, because I am pretty darn sure that they must do something to protect from like a distributed denial service attack for an EC2. Um, okay, so here we go. Actually, I misread. They have, it looks like Shield standard is always free and it's probably automatically turned on. And so I got this wrong before, and I apologize about that. So this is good to talk about because I was like, there's no way AWS is going to let us throw an EC2 up on the internet and not protect against like a DDoS attack. So some of the other more advanced services aren't, but AWS does give us a bit of a walled garden in terms of security. So there is some built-in stuff that we're getting out of the box on the AWS free tier, and it's good enough for hobby stuff because if you don't have anything super important, you're probably not going to be a target. Um, I would actually encourage folks to look at stuff like um, there's services like Render, where if you put something in a Docker container, um, you can deploy like very quickly, like a whole website or web app. Um, Unless you specifically want to learn more about that sort of DevOps side of things. I think speed of getting it out the door and shipped is the higher value, so you can focus on the application development. I don't want to get too much into this now. I'm more than happy to talk about it later, though. Tom, was your question related to the exam stuff or about other stuff?
Um, exam stuff? Question mark?
Okay. Can we save it to the end?
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's just kind of review this stuff and go through the practice questions and Tom, then I'll circle back. So we have a couple of these services. We have AWS Shield, we have WAF, we have Guard Duty, we have Macy, we have Inspector. Let's let's tackle some practice questions here. And let me pull up our list and see who's next. Cricket, you are on deck. So which AWS service helps detect unusual API activity and potentially compromise credentials?
I
WAF
think
Shield. Yes.
okay, firewall for database, machine learning for sensitive. I think last one, guard duty.
Guard Duty. Yes, sir. You are correct. Guard Duty is going to continuously monitor for suspicious behavior. Um, Thank you, sir. And as I said, I found these the hardest actually on the exam because I had the least experience with them. Bryson, you're up next. If you want to protect a web app against SQL injection, what AWS service are we going to use? Shield, WAF, Inspector, or Identity Center? Well, I can rule out Identity Center with the process of elimination. I know it's not related to this security related tools. And then the answer here is WAF, right? WAF's job is to block malicious HTTP requests, which includes if someone's trying to sneak some SQL into the query string or JSON. Um, Anyone familiar with the XKCD webcomic? So this has been around for a long time. The guy who writes it actually used to be like a programmer for NASA, I kid you not. And then he made this comic, and it's become quite popular in the tech world and beyond. Um, so SQL injection, because we've talked a little, but not a lot about web security. SQL injection is one of the common attacks, and it inserts malicious SQL statements into entry fields. Now, Django actually kind of keeps a lot of this from happening with like Django models and other things. So, like, just by using the Django framework, we're protected from this. But an example of this might be, let's do SQL injection attack example. So here's an example where we're grabbing the username and password from somewhere from a form that we're sending to a post request. And we're not using Django models. We're manually constructing a query. And the attacker has set the username to admin. Um, and actually, it set the username to admin or 1 = 1. It set it to some SQL. And so this SQL has been passed in as the username. And here in this query, right, we're building a query using these variables. This SQL has been injected. And this kind of basically breaks the SQL because the single quote like closes the SQL statement. This is always true. They injected a comment. So then the rest of our SQL gets commented out. And I think this would let someone log in as admin or something. Now with Django models, this can't really happen, but this has been like a classic way of attacking. And so this is what's called an SQL injection. And in this webcomic, the joke is the mom goes to the son's school, like this mom has her kid at school, and the school says something went wrong with the computer. Your son was named, uh, the son's name is Robert, single quote, close quote, semicolon, drop table students, right? And the joke is, well, our nickname is Little Bobby Tables. And so the joke is somewhere in the school's database, they weren't checking for SQL injection attacks. And because this was the student's name, it dropped the student's table. XKCD, by the way, I highly recommend. It is a great webcomic. Um, there are a couple classics out there for programmers. This is a good one. How long can you spend on making a routine task more efficient before you spend more time than the time you save? But going back to AWS and SQL injection attacks, even though Django prevents this, other software might not if we were using Flask. So WAF is going to monitor incoming HTTP requests to see if there's SQL in the username. Um, and WAF, I believe, stands for Web Application Firewall. So long answer to a long question, but hopefully useful. AJ, AJ may not be here. So let's go to next on the list. Tony, next question here. What service helps people identify personally identifiable information stored in an S3?
I would say C, Macy.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And Macy's using machine learning and it's looking for personal information. If a company wants to scan, and this is going to Chris, a company wants to scan their container images and EC2 instances for vulnerabilities, what service should they use? And so this one is Inspector. Inspector is going to do automated scanning of EC2s. And finally, what AWS service provides DDoS protection and is enabled by default? And this goes to Arnold.
I would say AWS Shield.
Yes, sir. As we just learned, and actually I
DDoS.
had not realized. Thank you, man. And good job, guys, and thank you. So you can play around with this a little bit. We do have a hands-on activity here. I do think the Cloud Quest game is the right starting point for the hands-on stuff, and this stuff is icing on the cake. This one is going to take some memorization. Again, like I encourage you to upload this markdown file into your AI study buddy to help build that sort of knowledge base. I found that very useful. Let's take a break. And then the last part that we'll go through, and I will move through this one a bit more quickly so we can wrap up soon, is governance tools. So let's take 5, and then we'll look at governance tools and call it a day. Thank you guys, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. Oh, and Tom, yes.
Yeah, one, can you leave that up? And two, I just might as well ask my question now. It's related, and that's why I was just kind of hesitant to ask it, but it was more like the supplemental why. And that's since we're on the topic of governance tools and security portion of the exam topic, how often would you say a full stack dev, someone dealing with these cloud services, would interact with, say, like network engineers, network architects, or insert that type of role at an organization, since they're the ones who typically construct, monitor, design the network's security protocols, policies for your organization and whatnot. I'm sure there's some sort of crossover to a degree of how people can access these AWS services and whatnot, and how these policies kind of have to line up in order for people to be able to do things or receive things and whatnot. So how often would you say, like, you got to coordinate and tackle this together?
Yeah, that's a great question. Specifically, so let me answer that in 2 parts. A lot of the things on the exam, the various cloud stuff, actually will come up even in junior full stack roles. As you pointed out, specifically this security and governance stuff comes up less so. I will say we spend a little time, not a lot, on web security, and I do think there's like a common understanding that's expected for software engineers on that, and I think we have a little bit of a gap there. But the reality is that gap is pretty easy to fill, and as I was saying, like modern frameworks do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. You probably will not interact a ton with any of these services as a junior full stack engineer. Um, like in year two of your career as a mid-level engineer, if you're at a startup, maybe. Um, if you're starting a startup or doing your own sort of business, then you would interact with it more. But you're correct. You're not going to interact with them a ton. What you will interact with though is stuff like AWS Lambda, which we haven't really talked about. And this idea of serverless compute and like what's called a serverless architecture. So like it, there's a way to run like just code, like a function by itself in the cloud without even having to like spin up Django. And there's like a whole nother architecture for a web app that's become really common called a serverless architecture. And this is we'll get to a little bit of it later in the prep course. This is much more likely what you will encounter. And in fact, I've talked with some of our hiring partners, and they told us we want full stack devs who operate in a cloud world, and they all do serverless stuff. And so you might have to interact with AWS for other reasons, even if you're not interacting with these security services. So serverless stuff like this. Um, when I was at a startup as a front end engineer, we hosted our React app on an S3 bucket, and we had a Python command line script basically. And whenever I had a new feature that was ready to deploy, I had to run the script and change a bunch of environment variables to have like the most recent git commit hash and a server IP, and it did a bunch of things. So the security stuff less so, but a lot of the cloud stuff, absolutely. So that was a long answer, but hopefully that helped break it down a bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, great question. Great question. Let me pause our recording here. All right. So let's talk about governance tools. We're going to talk about CloudTrail, config, and AWS organizations. So governance tools are for who did what, tracking API level activity, configuration drift, as you all have learned in working on bigger projects, code gets big very fast. And you could imagine how, with a big company with hundreds of developers, it could be very easy to lose track of the configuration of a security group, right? That's actually not a small task. And then dealing with and managing like multi-account environments. So these don't replace or block the security tools that we were talking about. They monitor and document behavior, right? And this is important not just to catch security gaps, but also for liability reasons, for auditing reasons. Um, did anyone hear about any of the scandals with Uber a couple years ago where like Uber engineers were like seeing where people were going in their cars? Let's go. Uber scandal, San Francisco government. There were a bunch, but one of my favorites was, let's see here. We'll give it a second to load. Uh, this one. It's from looks like earlier this year, but the Justice Department is claiming that Uber discriminated against passengers with disabilities, including those who use service animals. This is not actually the one I was looking for. Uber, they've done a lot of stuff like this. This doesn't directly relate to governance, though it does touch on other important things. Um, the one I was looking for was I remember reading that like Uber would figure out uh, Yeah, I don't know if I can find what I was looking for, but I heard like San Francisco when Uber first launched was trying to have city officials like use Uber to make sure they were treating people well, and Uber figured out who the officials were and didn't give them rides. Um, Uber engineers seeing where people go. So at a lot of companies, like software engineers have a lot of access to data. And if I work at a healthcare company, I might potentially have access to personal identifying information or sensitive data about people's health records. And so this stuff has to be managed and controlled. And Uber is a good example of this because I think it's just such a visual kind of impact. Like this is a great example. Like Uber employees were like tracking people they used to be in a relationship with, like where Beyonce or politicians were going, which all violates user privacy. Um, the point of this is why governance tools exist. Because companies, once you get big enough, you need to monitor what your employees are doing so that you can prevent actions like this. And if you have like laws that you have to comply with, have a record, right? Especially if I'm a bank, knowing who accessed like what when is really important. Like if some software engineer, accesses my bank account, I want to know it. Rick, did you have a question?
Um, no, I don't think so. Did I raise my hand?
Oh, okay.
Um,
My
no,
bad.
no, I'm good.
Cool. So that's sort of big picture on these governance services. Um, CloudTrail records API activity. So if I'm using the AWS console or the command line or other like software development kits or AWS services, CloudTrail will keep a record of who did what, when, and from where, right? So for instance, if like I go and delete an S3 bucket, or if I delete someone's name that I don't like from a list of people on an S3 bucket, we'll have a record of it. And in fact, it uses a different S3 bucket to log stuff. So these two things are confusing. There's something called CloudTrail and something called CloudWatch. When you hear watch, think metrics and logs. When you hear trail, think history of who did what when for API history. There's another tool called AWS config. This tracks when these configs change over time, which helps us to know, like, it can be useful just to know if a security group changed when it wasn't supposed to. Also, kind of like version control, seeing the history of changing. And we could even have rules to enforce. As it says here, AWS config is like version control for AWS infrastructure. It's version control for our resource configurations. If I change what security groups an EC2 is in, AWS config should track it. Tom, yes, sir.
How would a drift happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. Uh, Human error is a huge part of it. This stuff just gets really complicated. If you ever look on Hacker News for like incident reports of when like services are down, um, there's almost always human error. Um, are like and good DevOps teams are really good about not blaming the human. They call it a blame-free culture. This idea of focusing on systemic issues by treating failures as learning opportunities through blameless postmortems. So if we search for like a Google postmortem DevOps, so let's see if we can find one. Um, I don't know if I can find, let's see if we can find an example. Here we go. So this is an example that Google has. They've written a whole book on DevOps, on site reliability engineering. And so whenever something goes wrong on an infrastructure, a larger company that has a DevOps or an infrastructure or a site reliability engineering team, once they fixed it, they'll do a postmortem and it'll look something like this. Um, and it'll say summary, it'll be impact, it'll be a root cause. And this is actually a great, this is not quite to your point, but there's often multiple things that go wrong. And what you'll often see is like junior engineer changed a configuration or something that never happened before. So infrastructure drift often happens from human error, but we haven't really learned about this. I have software managing my software, and there's this term infrastructure as code, where we're writing code that's managing not my dozens, but my hundreds of servers and databases and other things. Again, think about if I'm Netflix. So I might have my code that manages all of my infrastructure do something silly. So those are some of the ways that this stuff can change over time. Um, Rick, yes, sir.
Uh, yeah. Whenever you say blameless, it makes me think of what was it, a couple years ago, the Cloudflare incident, and it was I mean, they ended up yeah, I don't know if they fired the guy, but I don't know if anyone remembers the Cloudflare incident, but it was like basically like 95% of the internet went down, and it was a good lessons learned for like internet, because we rely on all these like big companies like Cloudflare and Amazon to like run the bulk of the internet. But then when one of those companies goes down, like 95% of the internet just goes away. And it was a huge issue, and it turned out it was a bit of code that wasn't tested from, I don't know, a team or one developer, and it got it got pushed and activated before it was tested, and like 95% of the internet went down. You had planes that couldn't land, you had planes that couldn't leave, you had people in airports that couldn't board the plane because they couldn't access the database of like
Yeah.
passengers, and it was horrible. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure that guy got blamed pretty hard.
Yeah, I sort of remember that. Actually, if you could drop a link to that in the Buffalo channel, I would love to see what their postmortem was for that. And I have no doubt that they published one. I think that would be really cool to see. Um, AWS organizations is going to be sort of the last thing to cover here. Um, and this is for managing multiple AWS accounts from a central account. And it does a couple things. There's something called organizational units. You can apply policies across accounts, consolidated billing, um, stuff that's again a little more relevant to a bigger organization. So just to kind of summarize this stuff, we have CloudTrail for recording API activity, config for resource changes, and then for multiple, not users, but accounts, we have AWS organizations. Um, and we have some practice questions here as well. Um, and why don't we dive through these and then I think we can wrap up. So I think kind of coming back to the top, Tom, do you want to tackle question one here? What service is going to record all AWS API activity across an account?
Um, I think that's going to be Cloud Trail.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Trail is for API activity. Watch is for logging. Um, Sam, if you want to monitor whether my resources match approved configurations, what service should I use?
AWS config.
Yes, sir. Thank you guys. And Alex, which AWS service is going to let you apply policies across multiple accounts?
Eesh. Either I'll go B.
Yep, organizations. And this one I actually might be able to demo. I'll demo organizations at the end. I think we have some set up. And Alex, thank you, sir. And Rick, can AWS organizations grant a user permission to create EC2 instances? And this one's a bit trickier. I'm actually not sure myself. If we kind of walk through it,
I'm sorry, I was muted. I want to say D only with IAM rules roles. Oh,
I
nope.
was honestly I was with you on D as well. Um,
Man.
yeah. So organizations, they only set like the boundaries of where rules are applied. They don't actually grant access by by themselves. And then finally, Cricket, what service helps detect configuration drift?
That's the last one you explained about it. Config one, C.
Yes, sir. Thank you, and good job. Um, so I would space the practice tests out, right? We just started this yesterday. I would try like a practice test like every 2 days. Make sure you take a practice test as soon as possible if you haven't. If you take it today, I think like 2 or 3 days, and then taking the next one is the way to go. Because at the end of the day, in a perfect world, I would, review the practice test in full after I do it, spend time studying before the next one. But if push comes to shove, I'm going to be better off getting like 4 or 5 practice tests under my belt before the actual exam, even if I go into each of those practice tests cold. So if you got to choose, or if you're feeling pressed for time, or you're not sure, when in doubt, I would say just do the practice test. There's some optional hands-on activities. Again, do the Cloud Quest game first. And just to kind of wrap up, Cloud Trail records API level activity. Config, like you were saying, Cricket detects and audits configuration changes, often from user error, or if our infrastructure as code has gone wrong. And AWS organizations manage multi-account environments and the boundaries of permissions. And let me see if I can demo this one, and then we can um, call it a day. And if we go into the console here and we go to AWS organizations, um, I don't, I'm not on the right AWS account. I apologize. Um, But just to draw a diagram real quick, because I think organizations is maybe one of the less intuitive ones. Um, like we might have an AWS account here for, let's call it um, SWE full stack account. And inside it with IAM, we might have a bunch of different users. So I might have some users here, and maybe they live within a group, right? And we'll call this the student group. And then maybe I have some instructors. And let's make this blue. And I've got instructor A and instructor B. And let's grab that one there. So I have users and groups inside an account. And this might be all I need. But at Code Platoon, we also have the AI Cloud Ops program. And in fact, we ran into this issue the other day where something I think got deleted before it was meant to. And they're making AWS stuff all the time. So I want to make sure that the AI Cloud Ops students, and I actually have created multiple AWS organizations for exactly this reason, and it is unfortunately clunky and non-trivial to manage. I can have all of the AI Cloud Ops students creating all the services they need to over here, and I can have that be separate from over here. But then, if I want to do things like it'd be nice if the instructors, if I didn't have to add them in both. And let's grab this as well. And this is the instructor group. Right. And this is not students, these are instructors as well. And these are instructors as well. Right. Instead of having to do all this and have them have duplicate accounts in both. This is where things like, I think they called it the IAM Identity Center, which is a pain in the butt, let me tell you. But then I would use this so that I can have like my instructor users and groups in multiple sort of AWS accounts or organizations to kind of keep things organized. Um, Hopefully that helps illustrate things just a bit. It's non-trivial to set up. And again, the good news is on the exam, uh, we are not going to have to get down in the weeds on stuff. It is going to be totally conceptual. But so with AWS organizations, you can create multiple accounts so that you can have that really nice separation of concerns. All right, guys, that wraps up for today. Thank you guys very much, and hopefully this was useful.